What if everything you thought you knew about history wasn't the full story? What if the foundations of Western civilization weren't as clear-cut as we've been told? Today, we're diving into a topic that shakes the very core of historical narratives: race, power, and the hidden complexities of the past. For centuries, history has been written through a particular lens, one that often erases, distorts, or downplays the presence of Black and non-European influences. But new research is challenging those assumptions. From Geraldine Heng's groundbreaking work on race in the Middle Ages to the heated debates surrounding Martin Bernal's Black Athena, the past is being rewritten before our eyes. Why do these ideas provoke such intense backlash? What's really at stake when we re-examine the narratives that define our identity and heritage? Today, we're uncovering the truth behind the resistance to Black presence in history and why it matters more than ever. Welcome to Moments from History. Let's get into it. We often think of history as, like, set in stone, right? What we learned in school, that's it. That's the whole story. Yeah. I think a lot of folks feel that way. But sometimes, new research comes along and really shakes things up, makes you question those assumptions we all have, especially about, Western civilization, who really shaped it. Totally. And that's what we're going to look at today. It can get a little controversial, Oh, definitely. It's going to be good, but it's super interesting, especially if you're the kind of person who, loves to really get into the nitty-gritty of a topic. That's our audience for sure. They want it all, but they want it, clear and concise too, right? Efficient. Exactly. So, for this deep dive, we're focusing on a book that really caused a stir. Geraldine Heng's The Invention of Race in the European Middle Ages came out in 2018. And, it's not just about, pointing out that Black people existed in the Middle Ages, right? Heng's argument goes way deeper than way deeper. She's basically saying that, the whole concept of race, the way we categorize people based on, their appearance, that was being formed back then in medieval Europe. Yeah? And that those, medieval ideas are kind of like the building blocks for the race ideologies we see today. It's a big claim, for sure. Oh, it is. And as you might imagine, it's sparked a lot of debate big time. And, it's important to understand that Heng's book is part of a larger growing body of scholarship. I mean, we're talking 6 major books now. Wow. All looking at this, really complicated issue of race in the European Middle Ages. Interesting. And what makes Heng's work stand out, I think, is its scope. She's bringing together all these different fields: literature, history, biology, even sociology and anthropology. That's true polymath. Exactly. And that kind of interdisciplinary approach is so crucial when you're dealing with something as multifaceted as race, for sure. Now, Invention has gotten a ton of praise for its fresh perspective, but it's also gotten its fair share of pushback. Oh yeah, some people really don't like it. Yeah. And what we want to unpack today is why? What's behind these criticisms, and what do they tell us about, the academic world itself, Interestingly, this whole thing, the pushback against scholarship that challenges those, traditional narratives of modernity, right? This isn't new. There's actually a really important precedent we need to talk about. Oh, you mean Martin Bernal's work? Exactly. Martin Bernal, his book, Black Athena, The Messianic Roots of Classical Civilization. It came out in the late 80s, early 90s, and it was revolutionary. Oh yeah. Bernal basically flipped the script on how we think about, the origins of Greco-Roman civilization. He was saying that African influences, especially from Egypt and Phoenicia, were way more important than anyone had previously acknowledged. Yeah. And not just a little bit more important, he was arguing that they were fundamental. Huge Black Athena was a huge deal. Well, it went way beyond academia too. Oh yeah, there were documentaries, even talk of changing school curriculums. Wow. But it also sparked a major backlash. A lot of scholars really pushed back against it. And that's what's so fascinating. Totally. So too, illustrate this, let's look at some of the responses Bernal's book got, okay? So, a good example is this anthropologist Peter Allen. He wrote a review back in '92 of a film about Black Athena, and one of his main critiques was about Bernal's linguistic arguments, like how Bernal is connecting Greek words to Egyptian words, right? Bernal was saying that these similarities in, like, the names of gods pointed to, like a direct borrowing of religious ideas from Egypt to Greece, okay? So, like, if the Greeks and Egyptians have similar names for their sun gods, then Bernal's saying that means the Greeks got their idea of a sun god from the Egyptians. Exactly. And Allen's point was, well, hold on a second. Yeah, just because two cultures has similar names for their deities, that doesn't automatically mean they have the same, the same beliefs about them. Interesting. So, Allen, saying that Bernal might be oversimplifying things a bit, right? That he's maybe focusing on these, like, superficial similarities and not digging deep enough into the actual religious concepts. But here's where it gets really interesting, that even while criticizing Bernal's methods, Allen also acknowledged something really important about, like, the field of classics itself. He actually agreed with Bernal's argument that Western scholars had kind of like rewritten history to fit their own, biased worldview. Exactly. And Allen specifically called out this quote, virulent racism and anti-Semitism. Well, he said that Western scholars had probably downplayed those Asian and African influences on the Greeks for precisely those reasons. So even though he disagreed with some of Bernal's specific points, he was basically saying, yeah, there's probably a lot of bias in how we've been looking at history, right? He conceded that there was this possibility of, like, deeply ingrained bias within Western scholarship. That's a pretty huge admission, wouldn't you say? Oh, absolutely. But here's the thing. Even with that acknowledgement, Allen still seemed uncomfortable with Bernal's use of those terms, racism and anti-Semitism. It's like acknowledging bias is okay, but calling it out by name is like a step too far. Yeah? Like it's crossing a line somehow. And you see a similar kind of discomfort in Jeff Gardner's response. Now, the historian of Rome, yeah, that's her. In an article she wrote in '91, she expresses concern that terms like Black and African, they were already so, like, loaded, so politically charged, so much baggage that using them in scholarship wouldn't really change anything interesting. She seemed to think that, like, even connecting Greco-Roman history to discussions of race was somehow problematic, like it was tainting the historical record. So it's not just about, like, debating the specifics of Bernal's evidence. It's about this underlying resistance to even acknowledging that race might be a factor in pre-modern history. It is like they want to keep those periods racially innocent, Yeah, like, let's not complicate things by bringing race into it, right? And Allen takes this even further. He uses this tactic that's really common in these kinds of debates. What's that? He exaggerates the conclusions of people who support Black Athena, Okay? He picks out this Black studies scholar, Leonard Jeffries, and he calls him self-serving and makes fun of his suggestion that Bronze Age Greeks were Black Egyptians, okay? And he presents this extreme view as if it's the logical endpoint of Bernal's work. Like, if you agree with Bernal, you must also agree with Jeffries. But that doesn't make sense, does it? Not really. It feels like Allen's intentionally twisting things, pushing the argument to an extreme so it's easier to dismiss. It seems like the more reasonable conclusion from Bernal's work wouldn't be that one group completely replaced another, but that there was like a mixing of influences. Exactly. And then, by calling Jeffries self-serving, Allen's implying that there's this like monolithic Black identity, okay? That acknowledging Black figures in history is only done to benefit Black people today. Like, there's no other reason to do it right. Like, it can't possibly be about a genuine desire to, like, learn about the past and get a more complete picture of history, right? It dismisses that entirely. It's a way to shut down the whole conversation. It is. It's like your motives are suspect. so your arguments don't matter. Yeah, and that's a shame. Now, it's really interesting to compare this kind of resistance with how Frank Snowden, a black classicist, approached this whole question. Well, Snowden's work is fantastic. Yeah, he had a completely different take on black presence in antiquity, right? Snowden, he spent his whole career at a historically black university, and his focus was on the term Ethiopia. Ethiopia and how is used in those classical sources. He argued that it consistently referred to people who, like today, we would consider phenotypic sub-Saharan African. So when those ancient writers were talking about Ethiopians, they were talking about people who looked black to them. Exactly. And Snowden went to a lot of trouble to show that the Greeks and Romans, they weren't blind to these differences. In physical appearance, they noticed, oh yeah, they had words to describe variations in skin color and hair texture. So they saw the difference between themselves and the Ethiopians. Totally. So when Snowden argued that the term black, like how Herodotus used it, wasn't always the same as Ethiopian, okay? His point wasn't to say that the ancients didn't think about race, right? It was to highlight that they had like a more nuanced understanding of human difference than we'd sometimes give them credit for. That's a great point. So Snowden's not denying that race was a factor. He's just saying that it was more complex than how we often think about it today. Exactly. So those are just some of the ways scholars try to, bring black presence into the historical narrative. But, as we'll see next, this kind of work often faced accusations that really tried to undermine its validity as scholarship. Like, what kind of accusation? Well, a common one was this idea that scholars who focused on black presence were somehow lacking objectivity, like they had an agenda. Exactly. And a really good example of this is this volume edited by Mary Lefkowitz and Guy McLean Rogers. It came out in '96, specifically in response to Black Athena, okay? And they basically gathered a bunch of scholars who were, well, let's just say they weren't fans of Bernal's work. They were coming for him. Oh yeah, they attacked Bernal's credentials. They said he was prone to speculation, making these, imaginative leaps. They called him an armchair archaeologist. How right. They also implied that he was biased, driven by the sense of moral superiority. And they even lumped him in with quote-unquote Afrocentrist historians. So their argument was that Bernal wasn't a real scholar. He was just making things up to fit his agenda, basically. Yeah, and it's important to remember that within classical studies at that time, there was this, really strong emphasis on a particular lineage of scholarship, okay? There were certain texts and figures that were considered foundational, and you had to, work within that framework. And Bernal basically blew that all up. He did. He said, no, we need to rethink all of this. That must mean really threatening to some people. Oh, absolutely. So you can see how these accusations of bias and speculation were used to try to discredit Bernal's work. It's interesting, though, because as the article we're discussing points out, if scholarly objectivity is like the gold standard, then Lefkowitz and Rogers' own volume could be open to the same critique. Totally. I mean, they literally assembled a group of scholars specifically to refute another scholar's work. Yeah, and the tone of some of those criticisms, it definitely doesn't feel very detached, right? And it shows how hard it can be to maintain that so-called objectivity when you're deeply held. Assumptions are being challenged. Yeah, and this brings us to a really important point. It's about the different agendas and historical positioning that might be at play here, especially when it comes to identity. It seems like for a lot of white classicists, there's this unspoken assumption that they have a right to claim Greco-Roman history as their own, like it's the foundation of Western culture, and therefore it belongs to them. Exactly. Now contrast that with the position of black scholars, or those studying blackness, right? They're constantly running up against this idea, especially in Europe, that black people have no history before the transatlantic slave trade, they just popped into existence in the 1600s, and that leads to those ridiculously uninformed questions like, where were the black people in the Middle Ages? Oh yeah, I've heard that one. It's a question that reveals a profound lack of awareness, and it's tied to the very process of enslavement and this concept of natal alienation, as described by Orlando Patterson, is really key here. Yeah, alienation is the idea that enslaved people were systematically cut off from their past, their families, their ancestry, their history. It was all denied. They were made into genealogical isolates. Exactly. Treated as if they had no past beyond their enslavement. So when you understand that context, the whole Afrocentrist approach that critics of Black Athena were always bashing, it starts to make a lot more sense. It's a response to that erasure, an attempt to reclaim a history that was stolen. So it's not just about different interpretations of history. It's about viewing history through fundamentally different lenses shaped by whether your identity has historically been censored or marginalized. Exactly. And that brings us back to Geraldine Heng's invention and the fact that even decades after Black Athena, we're seeing the same kind of resistance. Yeah, it's those fundamental anxieties are still there, even though scholarship has moved on in a lot of ways right now. Heng's book, it's not Afrocentric, but it does center the presence of Black people, or Ethiopians as they were called in the Middle Ages, within this idea of medieval globality, okay? And she talks about the debates around this. Some scholars like John Davis, they argued that there was basically no contact between Western Europe and Black people after the Roman Empire, really, until the Crusades. But he also points to scholars like Paul Edwards, who found evidence of ongoing contact. Like what? Well, there are records of Africans in those Scandinavian settlements in places like Dublin, in Orkney. Interesting. And it's not just textual evidence either. We have bioarchaeological work from Rebecca Redfern, who studied remains in London cemeteries. Okay. And she found that a significant percentage, around 29%, had non-white European ancestry, which included Black, African, and Asian origins. Your study even suggests that this might actually underestimate the true diversity of the population. So there were way more people of color in medieval Europe than we often think. It seems that way. Yeah. And this kind of evidence really challenges that narrative of Black absence that's been so dominant. Yeah, partly because of that needle alienation we talked about. Right. So given all this, it's not surprising that invention has also gotten some pretty strong reactions from scholars. Oh yeah, some people were not happy, and the most talked about response was this really long review by S.J. Pierce. Oh, Pierce's review. Yeah, that was a big one. It makes some pretty serious claims about King's work. Pierce basically argues that invention doesn't actually challenge colonial and white supremacist historiography, okay? In fact, she suggests that it might even reinforce it. Really? Yeah. She says that Heng's book is still operating within, the dominant perspective of a Christian Middle Ages. Interesting. And Pierce identifies as a Jewish medievalist, and she uses the work of Judah Halevi, a medieval Hebrew poet, to argue that medieval understandings of race were actually pretty similar to modern ones. And she presents her critique as coming from this place of critical compassion. She says she shares Heng's goal of making sure that the legacy of the Middle Ages isn't just seen as pure evil, right? But as the article we're looking at points out, there's a fundamental difference in how Pierce and Heng approach Blackness in pre-modern city. And the review itself, even though it's criticizing invention, it actually does some of the very things it's accusing Heng of doing. Oh yeah. Take Hughes's critique of Heng's use of the phrase, the fullness of time, okay? Pierce argues that this is a colonizing move because it frames Jewish conversion to Christianity within this Christian theological timeline, right? But the analysis we're looking at points out that Heng isn't actually using that phrase in her own voice. She's ventriloquism, the medieval Christian perspective on conversion, okay? So she's trying to understand the anxieties of that period, not endorsing them. It's like if a historian today is quoting a source from the past, it doesn't mean they agree with everything in that source. Exactly. And it's kind of ironic that Pierce, in her attempt to critique invention for engaging with those dominant Christian perspectives, is actually imposing her own assumptions on the text. Yeah, like this is the only way to understand this, right? And it gets even worse. The review uses the term race-making over and over again, okay? And race-making is like a central concept that Heng developed in invention. Pierce even includes Heng's definition of it in a footnote, but she never actually credits Heng for coining the term. Wow, it's like she's claiming ownership of it. That's not cool. Not at all. And this pattern of misrepresentation keeps going. Pierce accuses Heng of treating England as like this universal model for Jewish life in medieval Europe. Okay, but Han actually spends a lot of time discussing the specificities of the English Jewish community, their wealth, their relationship with the crown, the whole chirograph chess system, right? Pierce basically ignores all that and then says, the book lacks nuance. It's that same strategy we saw with Alan and Black Athena, present a simplified version of the argument and then attack it. Exactly. And to top it off, Pierce's review, even as editorial errors like attributing a book to the wrong author. Oh, wow. Which is especially ironic given that she criticizes invention for potentially not being carefully edited. Yeah, that's pretty embarrassing. It really suggests that when scholars feel threatened by a work that challenges their whole field, they can make some pretty uncharacteristic mistakes. Like they're so focused on defending their turf that they lose their objectivity. Exactly. So let's dig into those like underlying reasons for this resistance to scholarship on blackness and pre-modernity, okay? The article we're looking at suggests that this incursion of blackness into fields where it hasn't traditionally been accepted, and this argument that blackness is actually foundational to those spaces, that can be really unsettling to some people. Oh yeah, it's like their whole world is being turned upside down. And it's worth remembering that neither Burnell nor Heng, the authors of these challenging works, are black. Interesting. So it's not even about like internal debates within a community. It's about the very boundaries of the field being questioned, right? Like who gets to define what counts as legitimate scholarship? And that feeling of being threatened, of having your whole area of expertise reevaluated. It might explain why we see these criticisms and these like oversights and these errors like they're grasping at straws. Yeah, and Pierce's misunderstanding of Heng's concepts of hermeneutic blackness and gnomic blackness is a really good example of this. Can you break those down for our listeners? Sure. So, hermeneutic blackness is basically the idea of blackness, okay? Often with these like negative connotations, like in medieval Christian thought, like associating blackness with sin or the devil. Exactly. And it doesn't even matter if there were actually black people present, okay? Physic. Gnomic blackness, on the other hand, is about the actual physical presence of black people. Got it. So one is like the idea of blackness, and the other is like actual black people. Exactly. And Heng argues that these were two distinct categories in the medieval mind. Interesting. She's saying that for medieval Christians, the theological idea of blackness and the physical presence of black people weren't always conflated. That's a really important distinction. It is. And for Heng, both of these fall under there's a bigger umbrella of epidermal race, okay? But the difference is whether that skin is, like, imagined or real. And Pierce's review misinterprets this whole thing. She focuses on the fact that terms like black and white aren't very precise when it comes to describing skin color, right? And she keeps replacing Heng's term blackness with race. It's like she's trying to avoid the word blackness altogether. Yeah? And it goes back to that anxiety about preserving medieval studies, racial innocence, which is a really problematic idea in itself. Totally. It seems like the real issue is acknowledging that blackness itself was a factor in pre-modernity. That's what they're resisting. Now, Fred Moten offers a really powerful way of thinking about this unsettling power of blackness, especially in relation to natal alienation. Oh, Milton's work is brilliant. He describes blackness as something extra-ontological, like it exists outside of our normal categories of being. Exactly. And he uses these amazing descriptions: a destructive healing agent, a stolen transplanted organ, something that operates in excess of how we usually define things. And he ties this back to the experience of people who were subjected to natal alienation, those who were treated as like non-beings, devoid of history. And this connects to the idea that recognizing Black presence throughout history really disrupts those narratives that are based on Black absence. It's a fundamental challenge. Exactly. And that challenge, that deep, unsettling challenge, might explain why we see these exaggerated criticisms, why there's so much discomfort with certain language, why there's such a strong reaction to scholarship like Black Athena and the invention of race in the European Middle Ages sense. So to sum it all up, we've seen this pattern of resistance to scholarship that brings Black presence into pre-modern history. And that resistance often uses these strategies like exaggerating arguments, questioning motives, overlooking nuance, even making errors. And it seems like those anxieties about identity, about who owns history, about the unsettling power of acknowledging Blackness in unexpected places, right? Those are driving those reactions. And for you, the listener, you know this deep dive. It shows you just how complex and contested this area of historical inquiry is. It's not just about facts and dates. It's about power, about who gets to tell the story, and about whose stories have been silenced. Exactly. So this leads us to our final thought for you to consider. How do the stories we inherit about the past shape how we understand the present? And what happens when those long-held assumptions about who participated in history are challenged? We encourage you to think about the implications of recognizing those marginalized voices, those present ideas that have been ignored or erased, not just in the Middle Ages, but throughout history. Because those voices, those stories, they can change how we see ourselves in the world around us. And that's what makes history so exciting, right? Absolutely. It's not just about the past. It's about how we understand ourselves today. So keep questioning, keep digging, and keep an open mind. That's the best way to learn. History isn't just about the past. It's about the stories we choose to tell today. And as we've seen, those stories are often shaped by power, perspective, and sometimes resistance to change. The presence of Black figures in medieval Europe, the true influences on Greco-Roman civilization, and the very way we define race in history, these are not just academic debates. They challenge how we see ourselves, our heritage, and the future of historical scholarship. So, what do you think? Do these new perspectives change how you see history? Let's continue the conversation in the comments below. And if you found this discussion eye-opening, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to Moments from History, and hit that notification bell so you never miss our deep dives into history's biggest questions. Because history isn't just written, it's rewritten. See you in the next one.